Well, ladies and gentlemen, I must be honest and say I'm kind of looking forward to this interview because when I was in Israel, I met Olga, who works for NGO Monitor, and they do some very interesting stuff in terms of tracking where funding for various entities might go. And so I'm very pleased to say that Olga actually agreed to do an interview with us. So welcome to the show, Olga.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So can you tell us a little bit, firstly, just before we kind of get into the detail, what does NGO Monitor do?
Sure. So we are an Israel-based research organization created by Professor Gerald Steinberg 24 years ago, actually inspired by the infamous UN Conference on Racism in Durban, South Africa in 2001. And, everywhere else around the world, I had to explain what that conference was and stands for. But I guess for the audience in South Africa, that is not the case. But to sum it up, basically, the civil society in a parallel NGO summit at that conference took upon itself to serve as the main vehicle of institutionalizing for the past 20 plus years the mantra of the slogan Zionism is racism, which we also colloquially refer to as the beginning of the BDS movement as we know it today. So our organization was created and until now serves as the only of its kind to provide critical reports and analysis on how civil society organizations, particularly those that define themselves as human rights and humanitarian NGOs, engage in the conflict of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And what our research shows is that a lot of them, instead of promoting this word causes, they promote anti-Semitism, oftentimes serve as Palestinian and Muslim Brotherhood terror proxies, incite to violence, glorify violence, and so on. Basically, try to deny Israel's right to exist as the only Jewish homeland. If that were not enough, then we added to that mix an approach which basically says follow the money. We wanted to understand who who funds these groups and where they raise their money from. And this is not the case for all of them, but definitely a lot of them are actually funded through taxpayers' dollars, through official development cooperation, humanitarian aid money. So that is what NGO Monitor does.
Okay. So you mentioned in Israel when we spoke, so you mentioned that there were a number of organizations, three, you mentioned three specifically, that are the broadest at the top of the hierarchy. They're the ones getting the majority of the money in order to fund, should we say, Islamist type activities globally. Who are those three and how are they connected?
So it's important to understand that if we're talking about a global network and they all work together. So even if one or two or three NGOs spearhead runs with something, the rest will pick it up. Now, we have a database of hundreds of NGOs, and they range from huge ones like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International and Oxfam that everyone would have heard of, all the way to a bunch of Palestinian groups like the three that we discussed when you were here in Israel. And they are Al-Haq, Al-Mazan, and PCHR, Palestinian Center for Human Rights. Now, all three are affiliated to a designated Palestinian terror organization, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And when I say affiliated or linked, what I really mean, and this is what all of our reports are based on, that is open source information, we can show that they have verifiable and easy to access by anyone links to this terror organization. Their leadership, appears at their events, sometimes holds double positions. So when I say open source information, right, that we can easily prove that they are linked to PFLP, that is exactly what I mean. All our reports are based on open source information, which basically means to the original websites, social media accounts, reports, events, statements made by the NGOs themselves. So these three organizations that are referred to as some of the biggest Palestinian so-called human rights groups, were just this past September, so September 2025, designated by in a special executive order by the U.S. State Department, not necessarily for their terror affiliation, rather for their abuse of legal systems, for their lawfare. And this is because they were spearheading the lawfare against Israel, and by extension, the US at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. And given that both Israel and the US are not signatories to the Rome Statute, right? The US felt that it is a direct threat also against the US to work with these groups, especially that the executive order basically says instead of promoting human rights, these groups serve as proxies, that are only seeking to abuse these international legal systems. Now, these three NGOs are not only active at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Al-Faq was one of the co-authors of the South African claim against Israel in the International Court of Justice, right? That was brought in front of the court in February 2024. When we analyzed the South African claim, we actually found 22 footnotes leading to similar NGO reports, all of them declaring themselves as human rights organizations. And we have this tendency of sort of believing them blindly, right? And referring to them as objective collectors of truth from the field, bearers of facts of systematic abuses of international law, of human rights, and so on, where in practice, they oftentimes serve, as we said, as proxies of their organizations. These same organizations were the first ones to launch the starvation campaign libel against Israel. The same goes for the apartheid and genocide libel. Al-Haq was also behind every attempt, some of them successful, to ban Israeli companies from presenting at security and defense trade shows in France in the last 2 years. And last but definitely not least, Al-Haq and PCHR and some of these groups were also behind lawsuits in UK, the Netherlands, France, Germany, Belgium, and US, basically trying to prove through legal cases that respective governments would be complicit in crime against humanity, right, genocide, by providing the state of Israel with arms, most specifically the US F-35 components.
Now, interestingly enough, you mentioned that a lot of the funding for these three organizations actually come from places like the EU. Tell us a bit about the funding.
Absolutely. So the EU is the largest donor of aid in the world. And the same goes for the Palestinian Authority and Palestinian civil society. In Europe, it's sort of part of the culture, the cultural texture, where the European governments believe that they have a responsibility, including taking parts of the official budget of each state and inject it into civil society. This goes way back to after the Second World War, where European governments wanted to make sure that there's a vibrant civil society that should sort of serve as a complementary and safeguard, if you want, not complementary, or maybe a safeguard to make sure that another Nazi Germany regime does not rise, right? So to have already a sort of a parallel political structure empowered by the people, right, through civil society organizations. But very quickly, it also became a mechanism through which they promote human rights, democracy, sustainable development in other countries around the world, far beyond the EU borders, right? And the Palestinian Authority and Palestinian civil society is one such area where they invest a lot. And when I say a lot, we talk about tens of millions of euros or dollars every year. So all three of these organizations in the last 20 years, because this phenomenon started actually after the Oslo Accords were signed and the EU became a partner, right, in building what they believe will one day become a two-state solution. They have invested millions, tens of millions in these organizations. But more importantly than money, they have entrusted them and they label them, basically legitimize them as their trusted partners. Because if you take a group like Al Haq, right, and you not only give them a grant year in, year out, but you also bring them to conferences and you quote their reports in official resolutions and official EU documents and German documents and so on, then you not only empower them financially, but you actually by putting the logo of the EU or any other government, you basically say these guys are trustworthy. We say that, right? We trust everything that they say. Now, the some of these groups, there are 6 Palestinian NGOs that are affiliated to PFLP that were involved in 2019 in a terror attack that took place on the outskirts of Jerusalem, which left a 17 years old Israeli girl, Rina Schnurd, brutally murdered on spot. And the 6 NGOs, their most senior employees were actually physically involved and consequently arrested. When this became public, we raised the information about their involvement with all the EU and the officials and EU member states who at that moment funded them with tens of millions of euros. And it just started a global debate where the governments, and this we're already diving into how the governments engage on this topic. And as you can imagine, not always open for discussion. They basically said this cannot be. And even if it is true, that just because there is 1 or 2 people in each of these organizations that might have been involved in a terror attack, that it does not implicate the whole organization. Now, it is really, to me, it is a cognitive dissonance because in any other sphere of life, we would apply simple logics, right? If let's just talk about that poor CEO who was caught cheating, right? Or at a Coldplay concert. He didn't cheat.
The Coldplay concert meme.
Exactly. Now, his adultery
Mm.
is in no way testimony to his inability to make sane business decisions, right? Yet his business career was over in a second. In a second. Now, we will do the same when it comes to our elected officials, but somehow when it comes to the civil society, to NGOs, gift to gifters, or UNICEF, or
We're going to talk about gift to the givers in a minute.
yes, we throw all that logic through the window, and we just say there's this sort of halo around them. The minute that they say that they promote human rights or that they provide humanitarian aid, we trust them blindly. And the terror organizations and radical elements have long identified this as an opportunity, and that's exactly what is happening. Now, since the European governments have stopped funding, the 6 organizations that I just mentioned were involved in the terror attack, but it has taken years of campaigning and raising awareness on this issue, and it remains a huge problem because what very few people know is that when governments provide humanitarian aid, anywhere between 10% and 1/4 of it actually is not delivered as physical aid. So not medication or tents or baby formula. Rather, it goes to what these governments label as political advocacy projects. And political advocacy projects in the Palestinian context almost always go to ICC, ICJ, warfare against Israel, basically different types of political attack against the legitimacy of the very fact that Israel exists as a Jewish state.
Let's talk about this a little bit more. So we know 3 organizations are responsible for the majority of the messaging. The majority of the money is coming from the EU. And they're the ones who ultimately are kind of like collaborating with all the different governments. So you mentioned that the ICJ case has numerous links in their reference notes all back to the same organizations. And so these organizations are self-certifying whatever they want to do and saying, we know this is happening because I said so, and I'm referencing myself when I said so. So it's kind of, it would be insidious there, but the reality is nobody is either willingly, it's either they willingly don't want to look at it, because as you say, they like this idea of this halo effect to people, or the alternative is that they're just complicit in what's going on. They actually kind of like agree with it, but they don't want to publicly say that because they know the member states are not really that keen on funding terrorism. So the question now becomes, where does South Africa fit into this? Who's funding the activity or the messaging in South Africa?
So you perfectly explain a phenomenon. I think it's not a phenomenon that is unique for for Israel or for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think it's a global phenomenon, and we see this around the world. What is unique for our corner of the world here is how disproportionately the volumes, right? How much of it we get, and more so, you don't have any other conflict-ridden area where there's such a concentration and polarization and politicization of the conflict. Even aid, they're unable to provide aid without politicizing it, right? Um, I think the goal of this campaign is not necessarily even to get Israel, convicted in any one of these courts. Or, you also have a Hezbollah front in their job that was created after a year after October the 7th, whose sole purpose is again to abuse legal systems around the world to hunt down Israeli soldiers when they're traveling around the world. And the goal of this is not to get any one of them actually arrested, because legally, let's face it, they don't really have a case. They don't really have a case. Israel is not an apartheid. Israel is not perpetrating genocide. Israeli army did not use starvation as a tool of war. All of this is rubbish. There's no other word for this. But the goal of this is to create an environment, an atmosphere in the global, public and media, where these words, genocide, apartheid, starvation, systematic violations of international law, and so on, are continuously repeated in the context of Israel, where it doesn't even matter eventually if it's true or not, because the majority of people will have heard the name Israel in the context of these words. Someone said it really wisely. In all the legal proceedings, they'll say intent to commit a genocide, risk of genocide, and so on. But when this is reported in the media, all these words next to the word genocide disappear, and genocide is the only thing that remains there. And I think that in that sense, it should be seen as a political warfare being waged by these terror groups that is completely complementary to the physical war. And this, as a phenomenon, is also not a novelty. The terror organizations have long understood, and terror entities or radical entities look at Putin's Russia. They also, the only war they're waging is not a physical war in Ukraine or against Ukraine. They're waging a political war, a resources war, a war of sphere of influence. All terror entities, all radical entities operate the same. The challenge on our end is that our respective societies don't have policies in place that are adapted to address this, to identify it, call it by its name, let alone sanction it, because for that we need to regulate the space and we need to be able to identify the problem by what it is. Now, you want to talk about the South African context a bit? Well,
and how it goes, how it actually connects here. Yes, 100%.
so look, there are countries where these NGOs operate in contrast to the official line of of their respective governments. You'll have a situation where Germany says Israel's right to exist as a state and Israel's right to defend itself is part of Germany's Staatsräson, right? The raison d'etre of the country. And actually, this is a line that is included in every government's coalition agreement. And then when you have a situation, the German government is funding a terror-affiliated and Palestinian NGO that works directly to undermine that. Or an even better example, when South Africa had the claim against Israel at ICJ, right? Then Germany was one of the state parties that wanted to intervene on behalf of Israel. But then you have a paradoxical situation that the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs is funding an NGO that it was a co-author of the South African claim, right? But in South African case, you have a different situation where the official South African line is very critical of Israel, right? And I'm being kind. South Africa is the one that is making the legal case against Israel at the International Court of Justice. So it does not come as a surprise that there's also a lot of foundations and a lot of civil society in South Africa that operates very freely and very critically of Israel. Now, if these groups were only critical of Israel, that would be okay. You know, you can have an opinion on the conflict, occupation, 67 line, green line, you know, where the border should be. But when that line is crossed and these groups deny Israel's right to exist as a Jewish homeland, well, they paint Zionism as supremacist political movement, racist, and so on, and throw labels like apartheid and genocide and starvation, then these become issues. Now, I mentioned the Gift of the Givers, right? The South African Foundation. I think it is.
Yeah, and just for context,
Mhm.
at the weekend, Gift to the Giver became very renowned because we had a refugee plane come into South Africa from Palestine that shouldn't have been here, and the Gift of the Givers were the ones that ultimately called up the government and said, can you have these people released to us and we'll look after them? So people are now wondering what's going on with the Gift of the Givers. And it's very important to understand that the Suleiman, the individual who runs it, is a proud Islamist. And that's not being libelous. He is a proud Islamist. He actually stood in the 94 elections as part of the
Muslim
Muslim
Party,
party that
yes.
advocated for Sharia law. So he is well known on his positions. He's publicly said in the public domain, if he has to choose between the legal system of a state and Sharia law, he'll always pick Sharia law because that law trumps every other law in the world. So I'm not saying things that he's not on record saying, but that's led many individuals to wonder, what is his connection to all of this?
And not only that, but like he officially states that the Gift of the Givers was he created it as a result of direct instruction that he received from his spiritual mentor Sheikh, who also promotes Islamist teachings and so on. Now, I'm not sure if this is going to be a novelty because anyone who Googles his name will have read that Suleiman it was a co-founder of the South African chapter of Al Aqsa Foundation, and amongst others, that the Gift of the Givers was also giving donations, making donations to Union of Good, which is basically a bona fide Hamas entity in Gaza. In 2008, it was designated as such by the US State Department as a Hamas basically entity. And we have some public records that Suleiman and the Gift of the Givers were giving them funds even in 2011, meaning way after the designation of the US State Department. Now, but let's clarify something. Gifts of the Givers on paper provide aid and rescue missions and disaster relief services around the world. They say, I think, 47 countries or something like that. But it's important to understand when it comes to Gaza, there are no NGOs that don't know what's going on. Anyone who operates inside of Gaza is either, at least in the best of cases, is fully aware of the extent of the police state that Hamas was running, or was completely complicit. Right? This is a fact. The Hamas was doing surveillance on all NGO activists. The NGOs had to run the list of employees and the list of grants by Hamas people in Gaza. Hamas was involved in deciding together and coordinating with NGOs who to give grants, assistance to, and who not. A lot of these were distributed according to Hamas list of priority. There, we have on record number of organizations that worked in Gaza and provided cash assistance. Now, contrary to what your listeners might think, it doesn't mean that there's an organization that comes with a suitcase with $2 million in cash to distribute in Gaza. Rather, these are distributed to something that is called digital wallets. And then there's a network of what they call exchangers in Gaza. Think of it as the Gaza version of Western Union, if you'd like, who basically would take this digital wallet and give you the cash on spot. Now, it is believed that at least 1/3 of these exchangers literally belong to Hamas. But for any one of them, it is a known fact that Hamas was taking their cut anywhere between 20 and 40%. To think that anyone could have come into Gaza and operated without knowing that this is happening, without coordinating to a certain extent with Hamas, is completely being naive. Now, the problem is that I have is not even that a lot of the organizations would say, okay, my mandate is to provide aid. I want to reach the population in need. So, Gaza is ran by Hamas, so I don't have a choice but to coordinate with them to some extent. That I can even wrap my mind around. What I cannot understand and what I will not accept is that after October the 7th and everything that happened on October the 7th and that transpired after, every one of these organizations, including Dr. Suleiman and Gifter,
Gift to the givers.
exactly, every time that there was evidence of systematic appropriation of aid or abuse of infrastructure. Every time that there was a media report that Israeli army targeted a hospital, right? The NGOs did not say yes, but it's a police state, and every hospital had a Hamas wing, and Hamas was using civilians as human shields. On the contrary, they went out with statements echoing Hamas narrative and condemning Israel. We had original Hamas documents that were taken from Gaza that clearly show, like in the Hamas documents, they say every hospital and medical center in Gaza is to have a Hamas wing. Everyone working in the hospital and every NGO working there knows that this is the way that they should not approach. Most certainly when there is Hamas people around, and definitely when there are Hamas operatives, for example, they're being rescued or brought for medical care or whatever. But not only for medical care, they were using this as military bases because they were protected and because part of the warfare of was portraying this global picture, right? That makes Israel look like the bad guy, like the pariah state. And this is how you have a complete moral inversion basically take place, where you have a designated terror organization by most governments around the world that committed the worst pogrom against Jews since the Holocaust. And yet the country, a democratic state that is going out to defend its civilians, is being seen as the pariah state. And instead of saying, but hold on, let's investigate, how is all this happening? You have the entire humanitarian community and human rights community only parroting and echoing their narratives.
Okay, so I need to try to understand now. So obviously what you're saying is effectively that what we're seeing is gift to the giver is well aware that the funds that go through it, that it channels to the Palestinian cause, is going via Hamas. So they're getting money from, effectively they're giving money to Hamas. So even if they try to say, well, we're not, you'd say, well, no, they are, because they know that Hamas skims money off the top. So it's kind of like everybody knows that, so they know that. So, and what you're
Well,
then
would you,
suggesting is
you know,
that,
it would be the same, Byron, as saying, we gave to a foundation that is ran by an Al Qaeda person, but we have proper and sufficient vetting mechanisms in place. So we know that none of that money went to pay the guy who hijacked the plane and flew it into the Twin Towers. I mean, money is
no,
fungible.
I think I understand that. Yeah, yeah. So the key thing there is, okay. So Suleiman is then pushing forward forms of should we call it pro propaganda or pro Palestinian propaganda? Because as you described, there's a lot of the documentation, and some people will be very critical of that propaganda. Some of them will say it's not true. Some of them will say it is. That's not the point. So the point effectively then becomes, what is Suleiman's connection through to these top funders, the three that you mentioned before, and what is his connection to the South African government? How much interaction is he having with the South African government in terms of how is he getting the money from our state in order to fund his operations?
Well, look, he's been running a very successful non-for-profit operation that has channeled millions of dollars, right, since the creation. He clearly works very closely with the government. But again, we spoke about the echo chamber, right? It's not only the money, the government looks up to him as a source of expertise. Um, uh, you know, uh,
Are we going to talk about that in a second? So if we just get through the money aspect, that's the first part, and then we definitely need to talk about the what the government goes to him for, because that's becoming
But
more
that
and
is
more important by the
I
day.
won't be able to even answer this question for you. I think that is the question that you and all the viewers in South Africa need to demand that the government reforms. Most governments are not transparent on this issue. So it begs the question whether there is any publicly available information on um, how much
For
exactly,
NGOs, well, kind
and
of.
where the money goes.
Mm.
And this is the issue is not necessarily how much. The question is, does the government know? Are they giving them money? What are the conditions, right? What does the contract between the government and Dr. Suleiman look like? And are there any safeguards in that contract making sure that should there be made known that some of their money goes directly to Hamas and we have evidence, what is the government doing about it, right? Um,
So more importantly is, I don't know if you know this, but in South Africa we have KFC, and at KFC, every time you order chicken, they ask you if you want to add a £2 donation. Now that £2 donation, okay, I know it's not a lot of money, it's like £2, you can't give more. That directly goes to gift to the givers.
so it is
So KFC themselves are collecting money for the
So
gift
there's
givers.
another question. Do KFC know where the money is going? And I think it's a perfect, I did not know that, but I think it's an illustrative example. And there's many such examples around the world. In Australia, you have a huge charity World Vision, right, that collects money similarly. It's the same level like UNICEF used to sell their Christmas postcards, and you would basically be making a donation. But that is a question. Who knows if the businesses know and whether the public knows where does that money go to? And if they knew, would they be okay knowing that they funded a Hamas operation, that it was proven that Union of Goods is a front for Hamas. This is basically a channel to embezzle aid money and allow it to go straight to Hamas senior officials. I think we have it's a situation that surpasses $2 or any one of these donations. I think it's a question that hits to the core. We don't know. We don't know, and yet we're sending money blindly to a conflict-ridden area, to a terror enclave that is ran by a terror organization, why would we even assume that it will not go to Hamas, right? We're all here sitting, busying ourselves with trying to prove that it is going to Hamas. To my mind, logic would say, show me how it wouldn't in a territory that is completely controlled by a terror organization. And instead of having state intervention that says, it is my obligation to make sure that taxpayers' money, but any other, allowing Dr. Suleiman to raise funds like that does not end up in their money, it would be an imperative. But look, it's not the only example. I don't know if you will know this, but South Africa and NGOs and foundations were also involved in a smaller scale, but equally dramatic NGO scandal in Brussels in the winter of 2024, not connected to Israel and the conflict and the war in Gaza. It was the infamous Qatar Gate in Brussels, where basically there was a list of members of the European Parliament in Brussels that ultimately received bribe and lots of money to to change the human rights reports on Qatar in the respective human rights committee and subcommittees in the European Parliament ahead of the Mondial in Qatar, because they wanted their human rights global track record to be better than what it really is. And one of the larger donations was actually made through through a South African foundation. So there is something, I think, systematically problematic with how this entire field is regulated in South Africa, because it clearly allows for just about anyone to raise money from just about anyone and transfer it to just about anyone. And creating an NGO is the easiest thing in the world. It takes you a few signatures and a PO post box, right? And in 5 minutes. So it does not come as a surprise that NGOs, non-governmental organizations, would be the easiest to abuse or use as vehicles. But particularly in the South African case, there's clearly a lot of loopholes in how this whole field is regulated.
Yeah, so let's talk then about the gift of the givers and the actual influence they have on the South African government. So it looks like they have, I mean, the South African government will say, no, of course, they don't have that much of an influence. But I'm sure you'll know that one of the pledges made by Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa, during the GNU, which we now have, is we have what's called a national dialogue. So a national dialogue, we still don't really know what a national dialogue is, apart from just loads of people standing around saying things are wrong with the country, let's fix them. But the person that he's appointed to chair it is Suleiman. He's the chair. So the gift of the givers is the chair of it. Now, more interesting was what happened when it came out that Suleiman himself was involved in the Palestinian plane that arrived here, because it appeared, many people did some investigations, it appears that he's actually been shipping people in here for some time. So this is the plane that became to the public's awareness, but planes have been coming in for a good period now, and the government's kind of allowed it. So he's clearly had a direct line to flout forms of local legislation and local policy, and nobody's really challenged that until now that it's actually come to the media, the media's attention. But more importantly, out of all of this is what happened after that plane was stopped. He was on camera with the EFF, the MK Party, and the ANC. He had direct lines to all of these individuals, and all of them said after his meeting that they were there to promote the Palestinian cause. So it's very difficult at this point in time, which many people will say, that Suleiman's organization is directly aimed at providing aid to South Africans, because when it came down to it, his discussions with these three political parties, all left-leaning socialist type parties, I might add, was all about the Palestinian cause and very little to do with helping South Africa. So, from your perspective, what do you see as the gift of the giver's role now in our government? How influential are they?
Well, they seem to be very extremely influential. Not only to have, you talk about the direct line, but I think the fact that he was appointed the chair of that new entity that was created, the
National dialogue.
exactly the prestige and the respect that he enjoys everywhere, the access that he gets to media, to decision makers, he's seen as someone who dictates the discourse. Now, he not only has access to the government, but he can actually whisper sort of into the governmental ear. What does that really mean in practice, promoting the Palestinian cause? To promote the Palestinian cause on its own is not a bad thing. You can have an opinion on it, right? You can agree with it, you can disagree with it, but to promote the Palestinian cause is not a sort of punishable act. That's not terror on its own. What it is a very it should be a punishable act is to promote Palestinian terror, to promote Palestinian denouncing of Israel's right to exist, and thus basically denouncing the Jewish right of self-determination. To talk about a two-state solution where you're only promoting one state, right? But you're actually saying that the other state has absolutely no right to exist. To justify terror, to justify the crimes that happened, to call kidnapping of women and children that took place on October the 7th and holding them hostages, to refer to them as prisoners. These are things that we should not be hearing from people such as Dr. Suleiman with such access to the government. And I think that when you know where his motivation comes from, right? And you mentioned he stands for the Sharia law, etc. And then you know his track record of freely channeling money and working and co-founding the Al-Aqsa Foundation and channeling money to Hamas, then it's a direct line to what kind of consulting and advice he will be giving to the government. And I think the question is not how much access he has, but why would a government commission someone like that to draft basically their official positions on a conflict in a third country? I think it is detrimental to South Africa. I think it is detrimental to the legacy of overthrowing apartheid. South African people are the only people in the world who truly understand what apartheid was, and to basically abuse that legacy and to cheapen it, right, through what is currently going on, I think is mainly an insult to the history of South Africa and to what apartheid really was. I think with such legacy, instead of picking up places where true genocides are taking place as we speak, right? But instead to go to one of the smallest conflicts in the world, I think that just these are the questions that the people of South Africa should be demanding the government to answer, and they should be demanding accountability. Why is the government basically commissioning Dr. Suleiman and his clearly radical track record and radical ideology to dictate the South African policies? Now, to connect it to the three organizations that we were talking about, it's all part of the same ecosystem, right? They all promote and support each other. They pick up each other's narratives and, each promote them in their respective fields. So I don't know if there was any funding to the three organizations. Again, because how do we even follow the money, right? None of these groups issue financial reports. So it's not like we would know from their annual statements. We have to, we have to pick what is publicly available. So if the government that is transparent, and most of them are not, but when they publish a report and then they mention that they funded one of these groups, then we will know about it. But there is absolutely no way for me to, if I resort only to publicly available information, to understand if there was any funding between these groups. But it is not to say that there wasn't, especially that the South African connection is so clear and that these groups were so heavily invested in both bringing about the International Criminal Court in The Hague and the International Court of Justice in The Hague cases against Israel. So I would ask the question the other way around. Prove me that they're not intimately involved.
From your perspective, when you see everything that's going on in South Africa and you see the way that the ANC is interacting with these entities specifically, and it is an ANC interaction, you find that we have a GNU in South Africa, and the other GNU parties aren't that interested in the issue, but the ANC specifically is very invested. That raises two questions. The first is, why are they heavily invested? And the second is, what's their end goal here? Like, what are they actually after?
Well, why? I think part of this is just a failure of our democratic structures, right? That we should have had in place. So even when radical voices or individuals come into power, we should be able to keep them, in tow and in mind. But clearly, the regulations we have in place are not sufficient. Now, what is the motivation? I really think it's a clash of civilizations. I think we're looking into um, an attempt to preserve liberal democracies with all the issues and challenges. In a liberal, open, free, democratic society, people disagree all the time. And you will say something that I will fundamentally disagree with, and we will fight over it in a civilized conversation. And there will be space for both of us in the public sphere, as opposed to dogmatic, um, oftentimes Islam motivated, political ideologies and world orders, the ways that they regulate their society, that are now being, that they're hiding behind this aura of human rights and progressive ideas. But in effect, they're everything but. I think that a lot of these ideas are more dogmatic than very dictatorship type regimes that we have seen in the past, exactly because they relativized the morality. They relativize what is right, what is wrong. What used to be black and white today is no longer. Um, and I think that once we allow that to penetrate our public sphere and public discourse, we are on a very problematic trajectory that is going downwards. And I think, in the sake of protecting the democracies, and this is a global challenge, not only in South Africa. I think South Africa is in a particularly bad shape, but it is not alone, right? I think it is one of the greatest battles of our generation, um, to to really save the free democracies. The majority of the world is not organized in liberal societies. So when we allow them to come into our countries and become part of the political discourse, which on its own is okay, we should be the ones dictating the rules of that engagement in our respective democratic societies. And the reality that we are seeing in too many places is that they often come as refugees or underprivileged, and we want to help them and integrate them. But instead of drawing the clear red lines, we allow them to basically tell us, I fled from a bad society, but now I want to replicate it in yours. And I think that is one of the greatest challenges of our generation.
Okay. On a final question. So one of the things we discussed, so I remember asking you a question when I was in Israel. I said, look, what's with all the funding? Like, it's all coming from three organizations. They're propagating some of the messaging down. You can see how it's influencing us on a local level. We can see how they're pushing forms of propaganda. And you can see that the reason they're pushing their propaganda is it allows them to raise more funds. And I said to you, what's the end goal here? And you said, look, effectively this is just a giant money laundering scheme, because it's effectively a way for these entities to gain large amounts of money, skim a load of it off the top. Some of these people are living their best lives abroad, whilst the causes they purport to be pushing aren't really advancing, and the people are still living in very difficult situations. So talk to me a little bit about that, but I'll leave it there and I won't ask you any more questions after that.
Well, it's a very lucrative business. Think about it. You don't have a product that you're selling an emotion and an idea. There's an endless pool of money coming from governments, right? And if you become part of the system, it almost becomes on a renewable basis, right? You become one of the standing partners for many of these governments and their trusted partner. A lot of these people actually operate most of the time abroad, outside of Gaza or outside of Ramallah, right? So proportionally to their
A lot of them in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar.
and exactly, just like a lot of the Hamas seniors are far away from Gaza. They're living the most lavishing lives around the world. So NGO activists compared to the life standard, living standard in Gaza, for example, they have disproportionately, lavishing lifestyles. They are shutting down the corridors of parliament around the world, speaking on panels, attending conferences, jet setting, from place to place around the world, all the while talking amazing things, promoting human rights, you know, providing humanitarian aid, defending the Palestinian people. So now, uh, on one hand, it's a political activism, 100% par excellence political activism. A lot of it inspired by Palestinian terror organizations. Now, we can have a conversation. Is denouncing Israel's right to exist an ideology exclusive to Hamas? No, it's not. Right? Most of the Palestinian political parties also have military wings, and all of them, by the way, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine are designated terror organizations. But what we understand less as societies and as policymakers is that all of them also have charitable branches, right? NGO. Wait, Hamas was created as a welfare organization in Gaza and then went on to the University of Gaza, right? So they came from this soft, so to speak, area only to become full blown weaponized terror groups. And it is the same with all of them. So it is the intertwining between a very appealing, very lavishing lifestyle, where you are in many places regarded almost like a diplomat. We also in the 21st century, I think that being a CEO of a major non-governmental organization, speaking of Dr. Suleiman, grants you an even greater respect in the public eyes than being a diplomat. And thus it gives you access to decision makers around the world and an incredible power. But as opposed to a diplomat or an elected official, you owe no one any explanations. It is a completely, um, uh, you know, uh, void of regulation industry. I call it an industry because you can access any parliament, you can lobby any government, you can say whatever you want, and no rules apply to you, no checks and balances. So it makes it on. Think of how it must get into one's head that you can do just about anything. Now, the three organizations that we mentioned, and with this we can sort of complete a full circle. They're regulars at the United Nations. They hold conferences. They make official submissions. They're being quoted by the United Nations. Um, uh, Parliaments around the world. It is it is a very corrupt, morally and financially, industry. And it is about time that we call it outrage. It is not to say, and many people will accuse NGO Monitor of this, we are not saying that all NGOs are bad. Civil society is the backbone of any democracy, and we need a thriving civil society. But all of us, and they say us because NGO Monitor is part of a civil society, we're an NGO. We need to be held accountable for every word that we write and every report that we put out there. If we don't do that, then as societies, we're not up to the challenge to fight the face of terror in the contemporary society.
Well, thanks very much for all of your insights on that. I think I found it quite interesting when we spoke in Israel. It's interesting to see how this all kind of like fits together. And in the South African context, it's kind of important to understand we're not immune to this. In fact, we're actually like, it's actually easier for us because, as you said, NGOs don't really have any law governing them. And South Africa's not very good at enforcing our laws anyway. So NGOs, the operation of NGOs here is like, it's free haven. And, you know, we've long had arguments on whether or not, you know, NGOs in South Africa should have greater scrutiny, oversight, and regulation. But that's a different debate entirely. But I thank you so much for your time, and really do appreciate you taking the time to come on and speak to me.
Thank you so much for having me, and I could not agree with you more. I think scrutiny and the same principles you would apply to any other policy area should be applied to the civil society and NGOs. We owe that to our respective democracies, and we most certainly owe it to all of us as taxpayers.
Thanks so much for your time.